giant high fantasy, giant high fantasy. This giant high fantasy intellectual properties.
Okay, so a couple of little things. One, I think the range of pitches that you're using is pretty closed off. Okay, it's a little bit
Mhm.
limited. He's using like giant high fantasy intellectual properties. There's a greater difference between how he's saying giant and how he's saying properties. Giant,
Oh,
high fantasy intellectual properties. So like his ease at the end is pretty low there, but his giant is relatively high. The other thing I would say is watch out for properties. Properties has that fast D sound. So instead of properties, it's going to be more properties. Properties.
properties.
hmm
Mhm.
Okay. Can you say properties like 3 times for me? Properties, properties, properties.
Properties, properties, properties.
So one thing I'm hearing a lot there, I'm hearing properties, properties, properties versus properties, properties.
Proper. Pro- they're two piece here. So, pro,
Can you
yeah.
say
Pro,
purdies? Let's take off the first one. Can you say purdies, purdies, purdies?
pretties, pretties, pretties.
That's really good. Give me that sound. Let's add prop before that. Properties.
Proper. Pretties, pretties, pretties. Properties, properties, properties.
Better. We can make it even weaker. Okay, but that's I can
Mhm.
hear the fast D's. I'm not hearing that properties anymore, which is great. Okay, that's just something to watch
Okay.
out for there.
These giant high fantasy intellectual properties.
Giant high fantasy intellectual properties, right? Giant high fantasy intellectual properties. Do you hear that range that he's using?
Okay. This giant high fantasy intellectual properties.
Okay, so
Giant high fantasy. Mhm.
we definitely had more contrast there, which I like. I want even more.
Mhm.
I want even more. Hang on,
Even more.
even more. I'm
Mhm.
gonna push you.
These giant high fantasy.
Giant high fantasy. Do you hear it? Giant high fantasy. Can you try saying that for me? Unique. Giant high fantasy.
Yeah. Giant high fantasy. Giant high fantasy.
We can start going down more on fantasy. It's like giant
Mhm.
high fantasy.
Giant high fantasy.
Fantasy. Drag it a little lower.
Fantasy.
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 Yeah.
Fantasy.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah.
Fantasy.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Giant high fantasy.
Giant high fantasy.
Yeah.
Fantasy.
Uh-huh.